The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Harold Whitman's modest two-bedroom house in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. At 78, Harold had grown accustomed to the sound. It had become his most reliable companion since Margaret passed, 3 years ago. The house, once filled with the warmth of family gatherings and the laughter of grandchildren, now echoed with silence broken only by the tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Harold sat in his worn leather recliner, the same one he'd bought when his son Michael was still in high school, reading the local newspaper through his thick-rimmed glasses. His arthritic fingers trembled slightly as he turned the pages, a reminder of the decades he'd spent working at the John Deere factory before retirement. The Social Security checks barely covered his medication and utilities, leaving little room for anything beyond necessities. It was Tuesday morning when the phone rang, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Harold set down his coffee cup, the one with world's best grandpa that his granddaughter Emma had given him years ago, back when she still visited, and shuffled to the kitchen counter. "Mr. Whitman?" "This is Janet Morrison from Morrison & Associates, law firm in Des Moines," the crisp voice on the other end announced. "I'm calling regarding the estate of your late cousin, Theodore Whitman." Harold frowned, adjusting his hearing aid. "Theodore? I haven't spoken to Ted in, must be 15 years now. We lost touch after Aunt Ruth's funeral." "Yes, sir. I understand you two weren't close, but you're listed as his sole surviving heir. Mr. Whitman passed away last month, and his estate has been settled. I'm afraid I need you to come to Des Moines to sign some paperwork." Harold's weathered hand gripped the phone tighter. "Heir? I don't understand. Ted had money?" There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Whitman, your cousin was quite wealthy. He owned several successful tech patents from his early career at IBM, plus significant real estate investments. The estate is valued at approximately $12 million. The phone slipped from Harold's grasp, clattering against the linoleum floor. $12 million. The number swirled in his mind like leaves in a tornado. He bent down slowly, his knees protesting, and picked up the receiver. "Sir, are you there?" Janet's voice sounded distant and tinny. Yes, I'm here," Harold managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you say 12 million? "That's correct, sir. When can you come in to sign the necessary documents?" 2 weeks later, Harold found himself sitting in a plush leather chair in Janet Morrison's downtown Des Moines office, still wearing his best suit, the same navy blue one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral. The paperwork seemed endless, each signature bringing him closer to a reality he couldn't quite grasp. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, property deeds. It was like reading about someone else's life. "The transition will take about 30 days, Janet explained, her manicured fingers pointing to various sections of the documents. "I'd recommend keeping this confidential until you've had time to process everything and make decisions about your future." Harold nodded, though keeping secrets had never been his strong suit. Margaret used to joke that he couldn't keep a surprise party secret to save his life, but something about the lawyer's serious tone made him understand this was different. Back home in Cedar Rapids, Harold sat in his kitchen, staring at the bank statements and legal documents spread across his small dining table. The numbers didn't feel real. 12,400,000 and change. More money than he'd made in his entire lifetime of factory work. For the first few days, he didn't tell anyone. He continued his routine: morning coffee, newspaper, afternoon walk to the grocery store, evening television. But the weight of the secret felt heavier with each passing day. The silence in his house seemed more profound now, knowing that money couldn't fill the empty chairs around his dining room table. It was his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who inadvertently became the first to know. She'd noticed the legal documents, sticking out of Harold's mailbox, and with the nosiness that comes naturally to elderly widows, asked if everything was all right. "Just some inheritance paperwork from a distant cousin," Harold had said, trying to sound casual. But Mrs. Patterson had sharp eyes and sharper instincts. Must be some inheritance, Harold. That looked like some fancy lawyer letterhead. Harold's face, never good at hiding emotions, betrayed him completely. The slight flush in his cheeks, the way he avoided her gaze, the nervous clearing of his throat. Mrs. Patterson read him like a large print book. Harold Whitman, you old fox. How much did you inherit? And somehow, standing there on his front porch with the October wind rustling, the fallen leaves around their feet, Harold found himself telling her everything. Mrs. Patterson's reaction was everything Harold expected and more. Gasps, hand-clutching, and a demand for him to repeat the number 3 times. $12 million. Harold, do you realize what this means? You could buy a mansion, travel the world. I could be lonely in a bigger house, Harold interrupted quietly, surprising himself with the honesty. Money doesn't bring back the people you love, Dorothy. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. She'd known Harold and Margaret for 30 years, had watched them weather the storms of raising children, career changes, and health scares. She'd also watched the family drift away after Margaret's death, seen how birthdays went uncelebrated and holidays became solitary affairs. You should call Michael, she suggested gently. And Susan. They're your children, Harold. They deserve to know. That evening, Harold sat in his recliner, holding the cordless phone and staring at the contact list Margaret had written in her careful handwriting years ago. Michael's number in Phoenix, Susan's in Denver, and below them, the grandchildren. Emma, now 25 and working in Chicago, and Jake, 23, and finishing graduate school in Boston. When was the last time any of them had called? Emma had sent a birthday card in July, 3 weeks late with a generic message about being busy with work. Jake hadn't contacted him since Christmas, and that was just a text message. Michael called maybe once every 2 months. Conversations that lasted exactly long enough to establish that Harold was alive and well. Susan was even more distant. Their relationship strained since an argument years ago about Margaret's medical expenses. Harold's thumb hovered over Michael's number. His son, the successful real estate agent with the perfect family and the perfect house in Scottsdale. Michael, who used to spend summer evenings in this very living room, building model airplanes and watching baseball games with his father. He pressed call. Dad, is everything okay? Michael's voice carried immediate concern. In their family, phone. Calls outside of scheduled check-ins usually meant bad news. I'm fine, son. Actually, I have some news. Good news, I think. Harold cleared his throat, suddenly unsure how to begin. I inherited some money from your cousin Theodore. Cousin Ted? I barely remember him. How much are we talking about? Harold took a deep breath. $12 million. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Harold wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Michael's voice came. Through. Changed somehow. More animated than Harold had heard in years. 12 million? Dad, are you serious? This is incredible. Jennifer and I were just talking about how tight things have been with the kids starting college, and the housing market being so crazy here. And, wait, let me put you on speaker. Jen needs to hear this. As Harold listened to his son excitedly share the news with his daughter-in-law, something cold settled in his stomach. The first thing Michael had mentioned wasn't happiness for his father's fortune, but relief for his own financial pressures. The calls to Susan and the grandchildren followed similar patterns. Susan cried, actually cried, when she heard the news, immediately launching into stories about her struggles with her consulting business and her husband's recent layoffs. Emma squealed with delight and mentioned how this could help her finally afford a decent apartment in Chicago. Jake started talking about his student loans before Harold had finished explaining about cousin Theodore. Within a week, Harold's phone was ringing daily. Michael called every evening, sometimes twice. Susan began texting, something she'd never done before, sending photos of her family and updates about her day. Emma sent a care package with expensive coffee and gourmet cookies. Jake called to share funny stories from graduate school. Stories Harold was sure he'd never bothered to tell when he thought his grandfather was just a retired factory worker, living on Social Security. The first visit came 3 weeks after the inheritance was finalized. Michael and Jennifer drove up from Arizona, ostensibly for a long overdue visit, though they hadn't made the trip to Iowa in 4 years. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in their shiny new BMW SUV, all smiles and hugs that felt just a little too tight, lasted just a little too long. "Dad, you look wonderful," Jennifer exclaimed, though Harold hadn't looked any different than he had 6 months ago. "We've missed you so much." The kids wanted to come, but college schedules, you know how it is. They brought gifts. A cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Harold spent on clothes in a year, a bottle of wine he'd never drink, and a framed photo of the family from last Christmas, the one Harold hadn't been invited to because travel is so hard at your age, Dad. Michael surveyed the small house with new eyes, his real estate agent instincts clearly working. "You know, Dad, with your new situation, you might want to think about upgrading. This place is charming, but you could afford something with more space, maybe a community with other active seniors." "I like my house," Harold replied simply. "Your mother and I were happy here." Of course, Michael backtracked quickly. "I just meant you have options now. Speaking of which, have you thought about estate planning? With this kind of wealth, you'll want to make sure everything's structured properly for tax purposes," Harold nodded politely, but something in his chest tightened. They'd been in his house for less than 2 hours, and already Michael was talking about estate planning. That night, as Harold lay in his double bed, the same bed he'd shared with Margaret for 42 years, he listened to Michael and Jennifer, talking in the guest room. Their voices carried through the thin walls of the old house, and Harold found himself straining to hear. "Has to be smart about this," Michael was saying. "At his age, anything could happen. We need to make sure he understands the importance of family. Do you think he's made a will yet?" Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know, but we can't push too hard. You saw how he got when I mentioned the house. We have to be subtle." Harold closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come for hours. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and for the first time since Margaret's death, Harold felt truly alone. The visits became a carefully choreographed dance over the following months. Susan arrived 2 weeks after Michael left, armed, with photo albums and memories that she'd never bothered to share before. She sat at Harold's kitchen table, the same table where she'd done homework as a teenager, pointing to pictures with the enthusiasm of someone discovering lost treasure. "Remember this one, Dad? When we went to Lake Okoboji when I was 12, you taught me how to fish off that little dock behind the cabin." Susan's voice carried a warmth that Harold remembered from her childhood, before life and distance had complicated their relationship. Harold studied the faded photograph, recognizing the younger version of himself, holding up a small bass while a gap-toothed Susan grinned beside him. "I remember Margaret taking this picture. She was so proud that you finally caught something bigger than a minnow. I was thinking," Susan continued, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo, "maybe we could plan a family trip next summer. Rent a cabin somewhere nice, get everyone together. It's been too long since we all spent quality time as a family." The suggestion hung in the air between them, sweet and tempting. Harold wanted to believe in the sincerity behind his daughter's words, but the timing felt too convenient. Where had this desire for family togetherness been for the past 3 years? "That sounds nice, honey," Harold replied carefully, "though I'm not sure Jake and Emma would want to spend their vacation with their old grandpa." "Are you kidding? They'd love it. Emma was just telling me how much she misses our family traditions. And Jake's been asking about you constantly." Harold doubted that, but he smiled anyway. Susan had always been the more emotional of his children, the one who wore her heart on her sleeve. If she was performing now, she was doing it with the same intensity she'd brought to her high school drama club. Over dinner at the local diner, Susan's suggestion, claiming she'd been craving comfort food. She opened up about her struggles with her consulting business. The sob story unfolded gradually. Lost clients, mounting debt, her husband Derek's job search going nowhere. "I hate to burden you with our problems, Dad, but I've been so stressed. Derek's been out of work for 8 months now, and my business... Well, let's just say I'm not as good at the financial side as I am at the creative side." Harold listened, his heart genuinely aching for his daughter's struggles. This was familiar territory. Susan had always been the child who needed rescuing, who made impulsive decisions and lived with passionate intensity. But something felt different now, calculated in a way that made Harold uncomfortable. "I could help," he offered quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Not a lot, but maybe enough to get you through the rough patch." Susan's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to squeeze his weathered hand. "Dad, I couldn't ask you to do that. I know you've lived modestly your whole life, and I don't want you to feel obligated just because I have money now?" Harold finished for her. The flush that crept up Susan's neck told him everything he needed to know. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. "I just meant... well, yes, I suppose that is what I meant. But not the way it sounds." Harold patted her hand gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. Money changes things. I'm still figuring out how." The next morning, Susan helped Harold organize his financial paperwork, her business background proving surprisingly useful. She asked thoughtful questions about his investment strategy and suggested he might want to meet with a financial advisor. "You could do so much good with this money, Dad. Set up college funds for Emma and Jake, help Michael with his business expansion, maybe even start a scholarship in Mom's name. She would have loved that." The mention of Margaret felt like a calculated move, and Harold's chest tightened. Susan was right. Margaret would have loved the idea of a scholarship. But the way Susan presented it, wrapped up with help for her, siblings, made it feel less like honoring Margaret's memory and more like dividing up the inheritance while Harold was still alive to watch. Emma's visit came in December, timed perfectly with her holiday break from her marketing job in Chicago. She arrived with a suitcase full of expensive presents and an energy that reminded Harold of her grandmother. At 25, Emma had Margaret's laugh and Harold's stubborn streak, a combination that had made her teenage years particularly challenging. "Grandpa, I can't believe I haven't visited in so long," she said, wrapping him in a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and city sophistication. "Work has been absolutely insane, but that's no excuse. I've missed you so much." Emma settled into the guest room with the ease of someone who belonged there, though Harold couldn't remember the last time she'd stayed overnight. She cooked dinner, ordering ingredients for delivery since Harold's pantry didn't stock quinoa and organic vegetables, and filled the house with chatter about her job, her boyfriend, and her dreams of starting her own marketing agency, the He. "Chicago market is so competitive, Grandpa. Everyone wants to be in digital marketing now, and the established agencies have all the good clients locked up. I've been saving to go out on my own, but startup costs are brutal." Harold listened as Emma painted vivid pictures of her ambitious plans, her voice growing more animated as she described her vision for the future. She was passionate and articulate, reminding him of the little girl who used to put on elaborate performances in his living room. "How much would you need to start your own agency?" Harold asked during a lull in her presentation. Emma's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her wineglass. "Oh, Grandpa, I wasn't hinting. I mean, I know about your inheritance, and I'm so happy for you, but I wouldn't want you to think..." "How much, Emma?" She met his eyes, and Harold saw a flicker of the calculating adult she'd become. "Honestly, about $200,000 to do it right. Office space, equipment, enough operating capital to last the first year without clients. $200,000. A sum that would have been impossible for Harold to imagine just months ago now felt both enormous and manageable. He could help his granddaughter achieve her dreams, be the supportive grandfather he'd always wanted to be. but something in Emma's prepared presentation, the way she'd steered the conversation so smoothly toward her financial needs, made Harold pause. Had she practiced this pitch, knowing she'd have a captive audience for the weekend? That night, Harold called Mrs. Patterson, needing to talk to someone who knew him before he became a wealthy man. "They're all being so nice to me, Dorothy," he said, staring out his kitchen window at the snow-covered yard. "Emma made dinner, helped me organize my medicine cabinet, even offered to set up one of those computer tablets so we could video chat more often. But," Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 1 husband. "But it feels like performance, like they're all reading from the same script about being loving family members." Harold's voice cracked slightly. "Margaret always said I was too suspicious of people's motives, but I can't shake the feeling that they're all here for the money." "Maybe they are," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "But maybe they also genuinely care about you, and just don't know how to separate those feelings. People are complicated, Harold, especially when money gets involved." "I used to know my own children," Harold whispered. "I used to know my grandchildren. Now I feel like I'm meeting strangers who happen to share my last name." Jake's visit came, in late January, between semesters of his graduate program in Boston. At 23, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. But Harold noticed the designer clothes and expensive laptop that seemed beyond a graduate student's budget. "Grandpa, you're looking great," Jake said, though Harold suspected he looked exactly the same as he had the previous Christmas, when Jake had barely glanced up from his phone during their brief video call. "Graduate school is killing me, but I wanted to make time to see you." Jake was subtler than his sister, weaving his financial needs into stories about his research and academic aspirations. He was studying environmental engineering, planning to focus on sustainable technology development, work that required expensive equipment and research opportunities that weren't covered by his fellowship. "There's this incredible summer program in Denmark," Jake explained over breakfast at Harold's kitchen table. "It's exactly the kind of experience that would set me apart in the job market, but the costs are prohibitive. $15,000 for the program, plus living expenses." Harold watched his grandson's face as he spoke, noting the practiced way Jake had learned to make his requests sound like investments in the future, rather than handouts. It was sophisticated manipulation, wrapped in genuine academic passion. But what bothered Harold most wasn't the requests for money. It was the assumption that he would say yes, the entitlement that seemed to underlie every conversation. None of his family members seemed to consider that he might have his own plans for the inheritance, his own dreams that money could finally make possible. That evening, Jake helped Harold set up the tablet Emma had bought him, patiently walking through the video calling features and showing him how to order groceries online. It was thoughtful and genuine, the kind of help Harold had wished for over the past lonely years. "You know, Grandpa, I've been thinking about Mom's scholarship idea," Jake said as they figured out the camera settings. "But what if we expanded it, made it specifically for first-generation college students studying STEM fields? That would honor Grandma's belief in education, while also addressing a real need." The suggestion was thoughtful and well-reasoned, exactly the kind of legacy project Margaret would have supported. But Jake's immediate follow-up revealed his true agenda. "I could help manage it," he offered. "With my engineering background and research experience, I'd be perfect for evaluating applications and overseeing the program. It could even be part of my dissertation research." Harold nodded along, but inside he felt a growing sadness. Even Jake's genuine desire to honor Margaret's memory had become entangled with his own career advancement. Was there any part of his family's renewed affection that wasn't connected to his bank account? As winter turned to spring, the visits became more frequent and the requests more direct. Michael suggested Harold might want to invest in his real estate development company, a surefire opportunity in the booming Phoenix market. Susan needed a loan to save her consulting business, promising to pay him back with interest once she got back on her feet. Emma presented a detailed business plan for her marketing agency, complete with projected returns and a timeline for repayment. Each conversation felt like a performance, carefully scripted to appeal to Harold's desire to be a supportive patriarch. They all spoke about family legacy, about Margaret's values, about how proud she would be to see her family thriving. But Harold noticed that none of them asked about his own dreams, his own wishes for how to spend his remaining years. Sitting, alone in his house one April evening, Harold pulled out a legal pad and began making lists. On one side, he wrote down all the ways his family had shown him love and attention over the past 6 months. The visits, the phone calls, the gifts, the help with technology and paperwork. On the other side, he wrote down all the financial requests, direct and indirect. The second list was longer. Harold set down his pen and looked around his quiet house, at the photos of family gatherings and holiday celebrations, at the evidence of decades of love and shared memories. Somewhere in this house was the family he remembered, the children and grandchildren who had once loved him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. But as he listened to the grandfather clock tick away another evening alone, Harold couldn't help but wonder if that family had ever really existed, or if he'd simply been too naive to see the transactional nature of their relationships. Maybe the money hadn't changed them. Maybe it had just made their true motivations impossible to ignore. In the growing darkness of his living room, surrounded by the silence that had become his most honest companion, Harold Whitman began to plan his final lesson for the family that had forgotten him until he became valuable. Harold's decision to contact a lawyer came on a humid Tuesday morning in May, after a particularly painful phone conversation with Susan. She had called in tears, explaining that Derek had been offered a job in Seattle, but they couldn't afford the moving expenses. The conversation had lasted 45 minutes, with Susan crying about how this opportunity could save their marriage and their financial future. "I hate asking, Dad, but could you possibly loan us $30,000? Just until we get settled and Derek gets his first paycheck. I know it's a lot, but with your resources now, it wouldn't really impact you, and it would change our entire lives." Harold had agreed, as he always did, and within an hour Susan had texted him the details for a wire transfer. The speed of her response, the preparedness of having all the banking information ready, left Harold staring at his phone with a hollow feeling in his chest. That afternoon, he called Jenkins and Associates, the law firm that had handled his and Margaret's simple will years ago. Robert Jenkins Jr., son of the firm's founder, agreed to see Harold that same week. The law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian house downtown, its polished wood floors and leather-bound books, creating an atmosphere of dignity and discretion. Robert Jenkins Jr. was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had inherited both his father's practice and his careful way of listening without judgment. "Mr. Whitman, I understand you'd like to update your estate planning documents," Jenkins said, settling behind his mahogany desk with Harold's old file open in front of him. "Given your changed circumstances, that's certainly wise." Harold had rehearsed this conversation, but sitting in the lawyer's office, he felt suddenly uncertain about his plans. "I want to rewrite my will," he said slowly. "Completely rewrite it." "Of course. Do you have specific changes in mind? Or would you like me to suggest a structure based on your current assets and family situation?" Harold pulled out a manila folder he'd prepared, containing handwritten notes on legal pad paper. His arthritis made writing difficult, but he'd persisted through multiple drafts, needing to see his thoughts laid out in his own handwriting. "I want to leave most of my estate to charity," Harold said, watching Jenkins' face for a reaction. The lawyer's expression remained neutral, professional. "There are specific bequests I want to make to family members, but not what they're expecting." Over the next 2 hours, Harold outlined his plans. The bulk of his estate would go to establishing the Margaret Whitman Memorial Scholarship Fund, exactly as Jake had suggested, but managed by the local community foundation rather than any family member. Smaller amounts would go to the animal shelter where he and Margaret had adopted their beloved dog Rex, the food bank where Margaret had volunteered, and the literacy program at the public library. For his family, Harold had planned something different entirely. I want to give each of them exactly what they asked for, Harold explained, but with conditions attached, and I want to write letters explaining my decisions. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. Letters can be powerful, Mr. Whitman, but they can also create complications. Are you sure you want to include personal messages in your will? I'm certain, Harold replied firmly. I need them to understand why I made these choices. The will took 3 weeks to draft properly, with Jenkins carefully structuring the language to minimize potential challenges while honoring Harold's specific wishes. During this time, Harold continued his normal routine, accepting his family's visits and phone calls, while observing their behavior with the clarity of someone who had finally removed his rose-colored glasses. Emma visited again in June, ostensibly to celebrate Harold's 79th birthday, but really to present her refined business plan for the marketing agency. She had professional charts and financial projections, evidence of the time and effort she'd invested in courting his investment. Grandpa, I've been thinking about what you said about legacy, Emma said over birthday cake she'd ordered from an expensive bakery in Des Moines. This agency could carry on Grandma's entrepreneurial spirit. She always encouraged me to be independent and chase my dreams. Harold nodded, noting how Emma had never mentioned Margaret's entrepreneurial spirit until she needed justification for her request. Margaret had worked part-time as a bookkeeper for small businesses, hardly the career of a risk-taking entrepreneur. Tell me about your backup plan, Harold said quietly. Emma's perfectly rehearsed presentation stumbled. Backup plan? If the agency fails, if the market doesn't respond the way you expect, if the economy tanks and small businesses stop hiring marketing consultants, what's your backup plan? The question clearly hadn't been part of Emma's preparation. She floundered, for a moment before defaulting to optimism and determination, qualities that Harold admired but recognized as insufficient insurance against business failure. I won't fail, Grandpa. I can't afford to. Everyone can afford to fail, Emma. The question is whether you can afford to learn from it. That night, Harold added another paragraph to Emma's letter. Jake's summer visit coincided with his acceptance into the Denmark program, which he announced as a fait accompli rather than a request for funding. His confidence that Harold would pay for the opportunity was both admirable and troubling. The program director was impressed by my research proposal, Jake explained over dinner at the same diner where Harold had listened to Susan's sob story months earlier. She said I have real potential to contribute to sustainable technology development. This could literally launch my career. Harold watched his grandson's animated face, recognizing the passion and intelligence that reminded him so much of Margaret. Jake's enthusiasm was genuine, his academic achievements impressive, and his career goals admirable. But underneath it all was the unquestioned assumption that Harold's role was to fund Jake's ambitions without consideration for Harold's own plans or priorities. Have you considered student loans? Harold asked. Jake's expression shifted, confusion replacing confidence. For a summer program, Grandpa, the interest rates alone would make it financially irresponsible. Besides, why would I take on debt when you're in a position to help? The logic was flawless and entirely self-serving. Harold realized that none of his family members had ever considered that he might say no to their requests, might have his own priorities for his unexpected wealth. What if I weren't in a position to help? Harold asked gently. What if I'd never inherited Cousin Theodore's money? Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But you did inherit it, and your family. That's what family does. We help each other. Harold wanted to ask when Jake had last helped him, when any of them had offered assistance during his lonely years of widowhood, but he simply nodded and asked for the check. Michael's final visit came in August, ostensibly a family vacation that brought Jennifer and their 2 teenage children to Iowa for the first time in 5 years. They stayed at a hotel in Cedar Rapids. Harold's house was too small and outdated for their comfort, but spent their days with Harold, creating memories and taking photos that felt more like documentation than genuine family time. The real purpose of the visit became clear on the second evening, when Michael suggested they take a drive to look at some properties he'd researched online. "There's a beautiful senior community about 20 minutes from here," Michael explained as they drove through the Iowa countryside in his rental car. "Independent living, but with services available as you need them. Much more appropriate for someone with your assets." The facility was impressive. Modern buildings surrounded by manicured lawns, a community center with activities and dining options, apartments designed for aging residents with emergency call systems and accessible bathrooms. Harold could imagine being comfortable there, even happy. But the timing of Michael's suggestion, coming after months of financial requests and calculated kindness, made Harold suspicious of his son's motives. "It's expensive," Harold noted, looking at the brochure Michael had somehow already obtained. "Less expensive than maintaining a house, paying for lawn care and repairs, dealing with emergencies alone," Michael countered smoothly. "And much safer. Jennifer and I worry about you living alone in that old house." Harold wondered when they had started worrying, since their concern had never been evident in their phone calls or visits before his inheritance. But he smiled and thanked Michael for his thoughtfulness. That night, in his hotel room, Harold could hear Michael and Jennifer talking through the thin walls. Their voices carried the same tone he'd noticed during their first visit, planning, calculating, positioning themselves for maximum advantage. "He liked the community," Jennifer was saying. "If we can get him moved into assisted living, it'll be much easier to monitor his finances and make sure he's not being taken advantage of." "We need to be subtle about it," Michael replied. "He's still sharp, and if he thinks we're pushing too hard, he might dig in his heels. But that house is a liability, and frankly, he doesn't need to be managing this kind of wealth alone." Harold lay in his narrow hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, and listening to his son plan his future without his input. The conversation confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. His family's sudden attention wasn't motivated by love or concern for his well-being, but by desire to manage and ultimately inherit his wealth. The next morning, Harold was unusually quiet. During breakfast, responding to his family's cheerful chatter with nods and brief smiles, Michael, sensing his father's mood, suggested they spend the day doing whatever Harold wanted. "Actually," Harold said, setting down his coffee cup with the careful precision of someone who had made an important decision, "I'd like to visit your mother's grave." The request caught them off guard. Margaret was buried in Graceland Cemetery, a modest final resting place that reflected Harold and Margaret's simple approach to life. Harold hadn't visited since the previous Memorial Day, finding the experience too painful without family to share it. They drove to the cemetery in relative silence, Michael and Jennifer's earlier enthusiasm dampened by the solemn purpose of the visit. Margaret's headstone was simple gray granite with her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." Harold had chosen the words himself, though he'd since wondered if his children and grandchildren had earned their place in that final tribute. Harold stood before Margaret's grave for a long time, his family arrayed respectfully behind him. He spoke to her silently, explaining his plans and asking for her guidance. Margaret had always been the wise one, the person who could see through people's motivations to their true intentions. "What would you do, Maggie?" he whispered, too quietly for the others to hear. "How do I help them understand that love isn't supposed to have a price tag?" Standing in the August heat, surrounded by his family but feeling utterly alone, Harold made his final decision about his estate. That evening, after Michael and his family returned to Phoenix, Harold called Robert Jenkins Jr. and scheduled one last appointment to finalize his will. The final version of Harold's will was a masterpiece of clarity and purpose. Each bequest was precisely calculated, each condition carefully worded, each letter crafted to deliver maximum impact. Harold spent weeks refining the language, reading sections aloud to make sure his intentions were unmistakable. On a crisp September morning, Harold signed the final documents in Jenkins' office, with 2 secretaries serving as witnesses. As he wrote his name on the last page, Harold felt a mixture of sadness and relief. He had done what needed to be done, even though it meant acknowledging that the family he'd loved unconditionally might not have loved him the same way. Harold lived for 8 more months after signing his final will, months that brought continued visits and phone calls from his family, each interaction reinforcing his conviction that he had made the right choice. He watched them perform their roles as loving relatives while internally calculating their return on investment. In May, almost exactly a year after his decision to rewrite his will, Harold suffered a massive heart attack while working in his small garden. Mrs. Patterson found him that evening when he failed to wave from his kitchen window during their usual dinner-time ritual. The paramedics said he had died quickly, probably while planting the tomatoes he'd grown every year since Margaret passed. Harold's funeral was well attended, with family flying in from across the country and neighbors gathering to pay their respects to a man they remembered as kind and quiet. Michael delivered a heartfelt eulogy about his father's work ethic and devotion to family. Susan sobbed openly in the front pew. Emma and Jake served as pallbearers, their faces appropriately solemn. But even in their grief, Harold's family couldn't help but think about the inheritance that would soon change their lives. The funeral reception buzzed with quiet conversations about Harold's wealth and speculation about how he might have divided it. Everyone assumed the estate would be split among the 4 descendants, with perhaps small donations to Harold's favorite charities. Robert Jenkins Jr. had scheduled the will reading for the following week, allowing time for out-of-town family to make arrangements. The appointment was set for 2 p.m. on a Thursday at the law firm's offices, with all primary beneficiaries required to attend in person. The conference room at Jenkins & Associates had been arranged with careful attention to formality and dignity. A long mahogany table dominated the space, with leather chairs positioned for optimal viewing of the documents that would determine each person's financial future. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood surface. Michael arrived first, 15 minutes early, wearing his best suit and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested he expected to handle significant paperwork. He chose a seat with his back to the windows, positioned to observe everyone else's reactions to the will's contents. Jennifer sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral despite the excitement Harold was sure she felt. Susan entered 5 minutes later, accompanied by her husband Derek, whose presence seemed unnecessary unless Susan expected to inherit enough money to require his immediate input on financial planning. Susan's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but Harold would have bet his inheritance that her tears had more to do with anxiety about the will's contents than grief over his death. Emma and Jake arrived together, having coordinated their flights from Chicago and Boston. At 25 and 23 respectively, they carried themselves with the confidence of young adults who expected good fortune and had rarely been disappointed. Emma wore a conservative black dress that probably cost more than Harold had spent on clothing in 6 months. Jake's suit was perfectly tailored, suggesting he'd invested in professional attire with his grandfather's legacy already in mind. Robert Jenkins Jr. entered the conference room precisely at 2 p.m., carrying a manila folder thick with documents, and wearing the expression of someone who had presided over many such meetings, but never one quite like this. He took his seat at the head of the table, arranged his papers with practiced efficiency, and cleared his throat. "Before we begin," Jenkins said, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for legal proceedings, "I want to explain the process. I will read Harold's will in its entirety, including all bequests and conditions. I ask that you hold your questions until I've finished, as many of your concerns will likely be addressed in the document itself." Michael nodded impatiently. "We understand, Bob. Let's get started." Jenkins opened the folder and removed a document bound in blue legal backing. "This is the last will and testament of Harold Eugene Whitman, dated September 15th of last year, properly witnessed and notarized according to Iowa state law." Emma shifted in her chair, her hand moving unconsciously to her phone, as if she were already calculating how quickly she could transfer funds for her marketing agency. Jake leaned forward slightly, his academic training evident in the way he prepared to analyze every word for maximum comprehension. I, Harold Eugene Whitman, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils, and declare this to be my last will and testament, Jenkins began, his voice steady and professional. The opening paragraphs covered standard legal language about debts and funeral expenses, exactly what everyone expected. Michael relaxed slightly in his chair, reassured by the familiar structure of a conventional will. Susan dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, maintaining her role as the grieving daughter while listening intently for her name. To my beloved wife Margaret's memory, and in recognition of her lifelong commitment to education and community service, I hereby establish the Margaret Whitman Memorial Scholarship Fund with the sum of $10 million to be administered by the Cedar Rapids Community Foundation for the benefit of first-generation college students pursuing degrees in education, nursing, or social work. The room fell silent. $10 million, almost the entire inheritance, donated to charity. Michael's portfolio slipped from his hands, clattering against the table. Jennifer's carefully maintained composure cracked, her mouth falling open, in undisguised shock. $10 million? Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. But that's almost everything. Jenkins continued reading without acknowledgement of their reactions. To the Cedar Rapids Animal Shelter, in memory of our beloved dog Rex, I bequeath the sum of $100,000 for facility improvements and animal care programs. Emma's phone clattered to the table as her hands began to shake. Jake's confident posture collapsed as he slumped back in his chair, his face pale with the realization that his grandfather's wealth would not be funding his academic ambitions. To the Cedar Rapids Food Bank, where my wife Margaret volunteered for 15 years, I bequeath the sum of $100,000 for facility expansion and program development. Michael found his voice first, his real estate agent's ability to think quickly under pressure overriding his shock. Bob, there has to be a mistake. This can't be right. Dad wouldn't give away his entire inheritance to charity. Jenkins looked up from the document, his expression sympathetic but firm. Mr. Whitman, I assure you this will was properly executed. Your father was very specific about his intentions. If I may continue? To the Cedar Rapids Public Library Literacy Program, I bequeath the sum of $50,000 to support adult education and reading initiatives. The bequests to charity totaled over $10 million, leaving approximately $2 million to be distributed among Harold's descendants. In the silence that followed, everyone in the room performed the same mental calculation. $2 million. Divided 4 ways meant $500,000 each, still a significant inheritance, but a fraction of what they had expected. But Jenkins wasn't finished reading. To my son Michael Robert Whitman, I leave the sum of $50,000 with the following conditions. This bequest is contingent upon Michael completing a full financial audit of his real estate business and submitting a written plan for sustainable growth that does not rely on external investment from family members. Additionally, Michael must write and deliver a eulogy for his mother Margaret at a memorial service to be held on the first anniversary of my death, acknowledging the 20 years of marriage when she supported his education and early career while working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Michael's face flushed red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. What the hell is this? A financial audit? I run a successful business. I don't need... Let him finish, Derek interrupted quietly, his own expression grim as he began to understand the direction Harold's will was taking. Furthermore, Jenkins continued, the $50,000 shall be paid in monthly installments of $2,000 over a period of 25 months, with payments contingent upon Michael maintaining regular contact with his surviving family members, defined as a minimum of 1 phone call per week and 1 visit per quarter to any family member living more than 200 miles away. The conditions were specific, personal, and clearly designed to address Michael's pattern of neglecting family relationships unless money was involved. Jennifer's face had gone white as she calculated the true value of Michael's inheritance, $50,000 paid out over 2 years, with strings attached that would force him to maintain family connections he had ignored for years. My daughter Susan Marie Whitman Palmer, Jenkins read. I leave the sum of $75,000 with the following conditions. This bequest is contingent upon Susan completing a certified financial management course and demonstrating 6 months of balanced personal budgets before any funds are released. Additionally, Susan must establish and maintain a legitimate business savings account, contributing a minimum of $500 monthly for 12 consecutive months before accessing her inheritance. Susan's sobbing intensified, but Harold suspected her tears had shifted from grief to fury. The conditions attached to her inheritance directly addressed her lifelong pattern of financial irresponsibility and her tendency to seek bailouts rather than solutions. The $75,000 shall be placed in a trust administered by Jenkins and Associates, with funds released only upon completion of all conditions and submission of a written business plan for Susan's consulting company that demonstrates sustainable revenue projections without reliance on family loans or investments. Derek's jaw tightened as he realized that Harold's will had effectively blocked Susan's access to quick money while forcing her to develop the financial discipline she had never learned. The inheritance was substantial enough to make a difference in their lives, but only if Susan proved she could manage money responsibly. To my granddaughter Emma Catherine Whitman, Jenkins continued, I leave the sum of $25,000 with the following conditions. This bequest is specifically designated as startup capital for Emma's marketing agency, but funds shall be released only upon Emma securing matching investment capital from legitimate business sources, demonstrating that her business plan has merit beyond family obligation. Emma's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of anger and embarrassment that crept up her neck. Harold had given her exactly what she'd asked for, startup money for her agency, but with conditions that would force her to prove her business concept to objective investors, rather than relying solely on family wealth. Additionally, Emma must complete a business ethics course and submit a detailed analysis of 3 failed marketing agencies, identifying the factors that contributed to their closure and explaining how her business plan addresses these common pitfalls. Upon completion of these requirements, the $25,000 shall be released in quarterly installments tied to documented business milestones and revenue targets. Jake's inheritance was read last, and by then the pattern was clear to everyone in the room. Harold had crafted bequests that gave each family member exactly what they had requested, but with conditions that addressed their character flaws and forced them to earn their inheritance through personal growth. To my grandson, Jacob Samuel Whitman, I leave the sum of $15,000, designated specifically for educational expenses related to his graduate studies. However, this bequest is contingent upon Jake completing 100 hours of community service with environmental organizations serving low-income communities and submitting a research paper on the ethical implications of sustainable technology development in economically disadvantaged areas. Jake's face had gone from pale to red as he realized that his grandfather had given him the smallest inheritance while requiring him to prove his commitment to the environmental causes he claimed to champion. Furthermore, Jake must demonstrate financial responsibility by maintaining employment during his graduate studies and contributing a minimum of 20% of his earnings to either student loan payments or a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. Only upon completion of these requirements shall the $15,000 be released for educational expenses, with documentation required for all expenditures. The room fell into stunned silence as Jenkins closed the will. The mathematical reality was devastating. Harold's 4 descendants would share less than $200,000 total, while over $10 million went to charitable causes. But the emotional impact was even more brutal. Each bequest had been crafted to expose the recipient's character flaws while challenging them to become better people. Michael was the first to explode. "This is insane! He can't do this! We'll contest the will! No court would uphold these ridiculous conditions!" Jenkins had clearly anticipated this reaction. "Mr. Whitman, your father specifically addressed the possibility of legal challenges. The will includes a no-contest clause. Any beneficiary who challenges the will forfeits their entire bequest. Additionally, Harold prepared detailed documentation of his decision-making process, including video testimony affirming his mental competency and explaining his reasoning. Video testimony? Susan asked weakly. Your father recorded several hours of testimony explaining each bequest and condition. He was very thorough in documenting his mental state and his reasons for structuring the will as he did. Jenkins paused, consulting his notes. He also left personal letters for each of you, explaining his decisions in more detail. Emma leaned forward, her voice tight with controlled anger. What kind of letters? Jenkins reached into his folder and withdrew 4 sealed envelopes, each labeled with a family member's name in Harold's careful handwriting. He asked me to distribute these after reading the will. The letters were passed around the table with the solemnity of final communications from the dead. Each envelope felt heavier than its physical weight, containing Harold's last words to the family that had disappointed him so profoundly. Michael tore his envelope open first, his fingers trembling with rage and shock. The letter was handwritten, on Harold's familiar stationery. The same blue-lined paper he'd used for birthday cards, and occasional notes throughout their lives. My dear son Michael, he read aloud, his voice growing stronger as anger overtook his shock. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have learned the contents of my will. I imagine you are angry, perhaps feeling betrayed or cheated. That sadness in your heart right now, that feeling of loss and disappointment, is exactly what I felt every day for the past year as I watched you perform the role of a loving son. Michael's voice faltered, but he continued reading. You called me every day after you learned about my inheritance. But in the 3 years after your mother died, you called me maybe once a month. You brought me gifts and took me to dinner, but only after you knew I had money to potentially invest in your business. You worried about my living situation and my estate planning, but never asked about my loneliness or my grief. Jennifer reached for Michael's hand, but he pulled away, continuing to read with the determination of someone forcing himself to swallow bitter medicine. The conditions in my will are not punishments, Michael. They are opportunities for you to become the son your mother raised you to be. Complete the financial audit not because I doubt your business skills, but because I want you to prove to yourself that your success comes from your own abilities, not from family money. Maintain contact with your family, not because I'm forcing you to, but because relationships require investment of time and attention, not just money. Michael's hands were shaking as he reached the end of the letter. I have watched you become a successful businessman, but I have also watched you forget that success means nothing without people to share it with. Your mother would be proud of your achievements, but she would be heartbroken by your neglect of family. Use this inheritance to remember who you used to be before money became more important than love. Your father, Harold. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The other family members stared at their own unopened letters, suddenly afraid of what Harold's final words might reveal about their own behavior. Susan opened her letter next, her hands shaking as she unfolded the familiar stationery. She read silently for several minutes, her expression shifting from anger to shame to something that might have been recognition. When she finished, she looked up at her family with tears streaming down her face. He knew, she whispered. He knew exactly what we were doing, and he loved us anyway. But he also saw through all of our excuses and justifications. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He says I've spent my entire adult life asking other people to solve my problems, instead of developing the skills to solve them myself. And he's right. Susan's letter had apparently been more gentle than Michael's, focusing on Harold's hope for her future, rather than his disappointment in her past. But the message was equally clear. Harold had seen through her financial desperation to the underlying patterns that had created her problems. Emma and Jake read their letters in silence, their faces revealing the impact of Harold's words. Each letter was clearly personalized, addressing specific conversations and behaviors that Harold had observed during their visits over the past year. By the time everyone had finished reading, the anger in the room had been replaced by something more complex: shame, recognition, and perhaps the beginning of understanding. "There's one more thing," Jenkins said quietly, consulting his notes. "Harold recorded a video message for all of you to watch together. He asked me to play it only after you'd read your individual letters." Without waiting for permission, Jenkins activated a laptop and projected Harold's image onto the wall. The video had been recorded in Harold's living room, probably during the winter months based on the light coming through the windows. Harold sat in his familiar recliner, wearing the cardigan Margaret had knitted for him years earlier. "Hello, my dear family." Harold's recorded voice filled the conference room. "If you're watching this, it means you've learned about my will and read my letters. I imagine you're confused, angry, and probably feeling betrayed. I understand those feelings, because I felt them too as I watched our family change over this past year." Harold's image looked directly into the camera, his eyes holding the same gentle sadness they'd all seen during his final months. "I want you to know that I don't blame you for being interested in my money. Sudden wealth changes everything, and it would be naive to expect it not to affect our relationships. But I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that your love for me would be stronger than your interest in my bank account." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but his eyes remained fixed on his father's image. "Instead, I watched you all become strangers wearing the faces of people I love. You visited more often, called more frequently, and showed me more attention than I'd received in years. But it felt like performance, like you were auditioning for the role of loving family members. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Perform love until it becomes real again." Harold paused in the video, and in that silence, his family confronted the truth of his observations. They had been performing, convincing themselves that their financial motivations were secondary to their genuine care for Harold. But Harold had seen through their self-deception with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. "The conditions in my will are not meant to punish you," Harold continued. "They are meant to give you the opportunity to earn what you asked for while becoming the people your mother and I raised you to be. Michael, prove that your business success comes from your skills, not from family money. Susan, learn to manage money responsibly before asking others to solve your financial problems. Emma, demonstrate that your business ideas have merit beyond family obligation. Jake, show that your environmental commitments extend beyond your own career advancement." The video Harold shifted slightly in his chair, and his expression grew more tender. "I have loved you all your entire lives, and I will love you even after I'm gone. But love without boundaries becomes enabling, and enabling doesn't help anyone grow. Your mother understood this better than I did. She was always the one who insisted you face consequences for your choices." Emma was crying silently, her carefully composed facade finally cracking under the weight of Harold's gentle but devastating honesty. "If you choose to meet the conditions in my will, you'll receive your inheritances and hopefully learn something about yourselves in the process. If you choose not to, the money will go to charity anyway. And I hope you'll understand that your value as human beings was never measured by what I could give you." Harold's recorded image smiled, and for a moment he looked like the grandfather who had taught them to fish and told bedtime stories and celebrated their achievements without expecting anything in return. "I am proud of who you all became, and I am sorry that it took my death for us to have this honest conversation. Take care of each other. Be kind to people who can't help you get ahead. And remember that the most valuable things in life can't be inherited. They have to be earned every day through your choices and actions." The video ended with Harold's gentle wave, the same gesture he'd given them at the end of every visit. The conference room fell silent, except for the soft sounds of crying and the whisper of tissues being pulled from boxes. Robert Jenkins, Jr. allowed the silence to continue for several minutes before speaking. "Your father also asked me to tell you that all of the charitable bequests have been structured to honor your mother's memory and values. The scholarship fund will help first-generation college students like Margaret herself. The animal shelter donation reflects the love she had for Rex and all the strays she brought home over the years. The food bank bequest continues the volunteer work she did for 15 years. Michael was the first to speak, his voice hoarse with emotion. How long do we have to decide about the conditions? The will specifies that you have 6 months to begin meeting the requirements, with progress reviews every quarter. The conditions are designed to be achievable but meaningful. Your father wanted to challenge you, not set you up for failure. Susan wiped her eyes and looked around the table at her family. What if we can't do it? What if we try and fail? Jenkins consulted his notes. Harold was very specific about that possibility. If you make genuine effort but fall short of the requirements, there's discretionary language that allows for partial bequests based on demonstrated progress. Your father understood the difference between inability and unwillingness. The family sat in silence, each member processing the magnitude of Harold's final lesson. He had given them exactly what they thought they wanted, money, but only if they proved they deserved it by becoming better people. It was manipulation, but manipulation motivated by love rather than selfishness. Jake finally broke the silence. He really saw through all of us, didn't he? Every single conversation, Emma replied quietly. Every visit, every phone call, every gift we brought him. He knew we were performing, and he let us do it while planning this response. Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and looking out at the busy street below. I can't decide if I'm more angry or impressed. It's brilliant and cruel at the same time. It's not cruel, Susan said firmly. Cruel would have been cutting us out entirely. This way, he's giving us a chance to earn what we wanted while learning why we shouldn't have wanted it in the first place. The afternoon sun had moved across the sky during their meeting, casting different shadows across the conference table. Harold's family looked exhausted, emotionally drained by the revelation of his final will and the mirrors he had held up to their behavior. There's one final element, Jenkins said, checking his watch. Harold established a family trust with $500,000 that becomes available only if all 4 of you successfully meet your individual conditions. It's designed to fund a family reunion or shared experience. His hope that working toward individual goals might bring you back together as a family. The possibility of additional money felt almost irrelevant at this point. Harold's true inheritance wasn't financial. It was the challenge to become worthy of the love they had taken for granted. As they prepared to leave the law office, each family member clutched their personal letter and a copy of the will's conditions. The inheritance they had expected to change their lives was still possible, but only if they changed themselves first. Walking out into the Iowa sunshine, Harold's family faced a choice that would define not just their financial future, but their relationships with each other and their understanding of what it meant to be worthy of love. Harold Whitman had given them one final lesson from beyond the grave, that the most valuable things in life couldn't be inherited. They had to be earned through character, commitment, and the courage to become better than they were. The old man, who had lived quietly in a modest house, whose love had been taken for granted by the people who should have treasured it most, had found a way to teach his family the difference between being loved and being worthy of love. It was a lesson that would take months to learn and years to fully understand, but it was perhaps the most valuable inheritance he could have left them. Whether they would prove worthy of Harold's faith in their potential remained to be seen. But for the first time in over a year, his family would have to earn what they received, and perhaps in doing so, they would rediscover the people Harold and Margaret had raised them to be.